Thomas Drake is a former senior executive at the National Security Agency, where he blew the whistle on multi-billion-dollar fraud, widespread violations of the rights of citizens through secret mass surveillance programs after 9/11, and critical 9/11 intelligence failures. In 2010, he was charged under the Espionage Act for his oath to support and defend the US Constitution, and in 2011, the government's case against him collapsed and he walked free under a plea deal. He's now dedicated to the defense of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I seem to recognize that phrase from somewhere. Speaking widely on privacy and security issues and the critical need to protect our inalienable human rights. Join him now as he provides a provocative peek at the present future of the national security state, the de-evolution of democracy, and the rise of technocracy from both a personal and professional perspective in his talk, The Gilded Age of Societal Surveillance.
Well, hi, everybody. This is my presentation for the World Ethical Data Forum. I've entitled it The Gilded Age of Societal Surveillance. Certainly coming to you remote from America. Have some few things to say, a little bit of background about myself. What do I mean by societal surveillance and sort of the challenges that we face today, especially with respect to data, and what kind of future do we look forward to? I used to work here at the National Security Agency for a number of years, both as a contractor and then later as a senior executive. An extraordinary agency. It was created in the Cold War, signed into existence literally in secret with the pen held by President Truman in 1952. And it's an understatement to say that during my years there, as well as supporting NSA's mission, even prior when I was in the military, I used to see a whole lot of data. I mean, just massive amounts of data. But I also was there during a period where the information age, which really kind of started with the telegraph, radio technology, and everything else we know, which was an analog world, the rapid transition during the 1970s and 80s to the digital era of the information age. And that just became an extraordinary period of just vast amounts of even more data being generated on scales that no one ever even possibly imagined. It's a long way from what I refer to as the golden age of computing in the late 1970s and 1980s. In fact, I have rather wistful feelings when I look back on this particular computer, an Atari 800, which was actually my first computer in which I learned all the basics, which still are foundational to computing of today. I mean, this is a system that was actually developed in the late 1970s, was available in very late 78, 79, and the maximum amount of memory that you could get with it at the time was 48K, and it had a 10K operating system. And yet this is where I learned to program. This is where I played games. This is what I used to hook up to an acoustic modem and that unique sound. It was just an extraordinary period, never imagining how rapidly things would shift as we moved into the 1990s. The Atari 800 was really foundational, although I worked a lot of technology in terms of the military and mini computers and other types of computers and other types of information technology that was emerging during this period. But it was really the 8-bit era in which I cut my teeth. It's fair to say that I moved on to an Amiga, which was really a 16-bit computer, and then just went on to other computers from there. But I'm just showing sort of the difference in terms of just how rapidly things accelerated, and yet this was clearly the dawn of the digital age. And what I like to really look at is sort of going behind the back doors of data. I think it's really important in terms of societal surveillance that we have to examine the looking glass. It's not often in sort of the dynamics of the real world and our everyday lives, just to step back for a moment and really consider what is happening, has happened, and what does this mean for us as a society going forward, where surveillance, with all the different meanings of surveillance, has become something that's both good in terms of value added to the benefit of society, but it's also been used to control, it's also been used to intrude, it's also been used to monitor. And this raises lots of fundamental questions in terms of how do we control it? How do we use it? How do we deal with it? I referred to this as the panopticon trap, that the visibility, ironically enough, is invisible as it is because it's always in the background in our everyday life, just imagining all the different ways in which we generate data, that we ourselves have become data generators. And there's more than enough, the feeds that we create as individuals are being gobbled up by all kinds of different entities. But my own warning, and I've been saying this actually for some time, is that it's a trap. That we have to be very careful as a society. And do we really want to allow the technology, as beneficial as it is, that there is a both and here, it's not something that is value free. And I'll say a little bit more about what that means in terms of data. All of this has value, but value to who? And it's cui bono, who benefits? All this data, even for the most mundane of electronic activities in our everyday lives, is being stored, collected. There is no such thing as something just going away, as it were, like the old days. Once you generate data, it tends to be quite permanent, non-perishable. So the other side of all this is it possible? Is it really possible to even have data security and privacy? Some would suggest they're mutually exclusive. Others would say it's oxymoronic, meaning it's a contradiction in terms. That the paradox of data security fundamentally violates any notion of privacy. But on the other hand, does privacy even matter? As I've said in other fora, you can have, you want 100% security, then you have to give up all privacy. I don't think we really want to live in a world where it's a 100% security. Some people will argue that that's sort of the end state, right? It's a zero-sum game when it comes to data security. But I'll say a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. If anything, it's information insecurity. And without getting into sort of the existential side of society and sort of what all this means in terms of the value and worth, there's both an illusion and delusion that somehow we can recapture, as much as we become data generators. What is it about all this, right, that makes us so incredibly insecure? And I would actually argue there seems to be a perverse or an inversely perverse or a perversely inverse relationship between information and security, which drives a lot of insecurity. So what we refer to as data, somehow we will gain security by having more access to it, including the data of our own lives. So I want to share for the moment a personal story, just to give you a sense of why a safe is not safe. Several years ago, my father passed away, World War II veteran, served in the military, Army Air Corps, flew secret missions for the OSS. And he retired in San Antonio. And one of the things that I ran across deeply buried in his closet was a safe. Now, it was a traditional safe. It actually was a model that looked very much like this. There was a key that you could use, but also had codes. And in his, it was actually circular. So it was like the old style, spin dial. The problem is I had the key, but I didn't have the code, the numbers. Looked all over, couldn't find in any of the papers. How do you open up a safe in which you have the key to the safe, but you have, in essence, a second authenticator, which is the actual dialed in numbers that will then release all the pins. And then you turn the key. I ended up having to call a locksmith. And I literally watched a locksmith drill holes, and this was a really high-end safe, drill holes very carefully to disable the pins enough to actually pry the door open. And it took about an hour for even a locksmith to gain access. And of course, he had physical access. So this was like a real safe. I mean, a safe you can see, a safe that had a real door, no back door. There wasn't any other way to enter it except with a real key and a combination. And yet it took a locksmith to break into it so I could actually see the contents of what my father had kept in there over many years. I cite this because we're in the Internet of Things, what some refer to as the IoT. There is no security in the Internet of Things. Any illusions that people have that you can actually secure any of your devices is really a delusion. Now, I don't care what firewalls you have. Yes, it's just degrees of insecurity. So depending on what you're protecting, again, the safe, what do you want to keep safe? So what is it that's private enough? To what degree will you go to keep it protected? Yes, I'm aware that people air gap. Yes, I'm aware that people offline things. But the Internet of Things has made things extraordinarily connected. So it's really, there is no security in the Internet of Things. There's just degrees of insecurity. And in fact, Internet itself was never designed, ironically enough, to have any type of security. It was intended to get the message out no matter where you needed to get the message fast as possible, no matter what was down or what was not working, just get the message out. And so it was designed to provide maximum transparency in terms of the data flow itself. And yet we see all these threats. And I'm not talking just all, antivirus. I mean, this started emerging even during the 8-bit and the early 16-bit era, where you started seeing viruses and other types of malicious actors, some just for the fun of it, others to actually disable things. But there's attack surfaces everywhere. And in fact, the N squared problem is actually a real issue when it comes to all this, because the more surfaces you have, that increases the attack surface as well. So advanced persistent threats are all about us. Some are rather benign, others are actually quite serious, especially when you move up to state actors or proxies acting on behalf of state actors. Covert channels. I used to be in the software and system engineering space. I used to analyze software at the code level. It's very easy to build in side channels. It's very easy to build in backdoors. Anybody who's ever seen the movie War Games from 1983, right, where he actually said, I always build in a backdoor, so no matter what they change later, I can always get in. Well, this has become much more sophisticated over the years. So how do you know, right? How do you know, even when you're quote unquote going through even quality control mechanisms, how do you know that there isn't some channel, some 0-day exploit, ironically enough, built into the code that you didn't even know about? And then there's encryption, quote unquote encryption of all kinds. Well, what kind of encryption? Yes, there's authentication factors, what you know, there's what you have, could be key, phone, credit card, etc., or what you are, which is, fingerprint, face, biometrics, etc. This has taken a number of different evolutions to up to now and including multi-factor. All of this has some form of encryption or the use of cryptography or ciphers in some fashion. But none of that matters, right? If you can bypass it, none of that matters if it's possible to compromise it. So my statement here is that, yeah, everybody is in everybody's business and in the business of everybody's data. We have data that gets commodified. We have data that gets monetized. And you have any number of brokers out there more than willing to sell your data. Selling your data for access, selling your data to have control over you, selling your data to make money. None of this is free. There is a societal cost. This is just sort of in the background, but now increasingly built in to what I have referred to as societal surveillance. Privacide. What happens in this space? Well, what is privacide? When the sovereignty of the person, their very personal space, their personal effects, and even their very moral agency, the ability to make choices, falls under the spell of the persistent gaze, especially unconsented intrusion. So think about all the platforms you use. Practically every single one of them, unless you've created this for yourself, are contracts of adhesion. So for the lawyers out there, this gets into terms and conditions. Yes, you can use the platform. Yes, you can use the app. Yes, you can think you're using it for your own benefit, but guess what? Underneath, yeah, all kinds of abilities of the platform, and I'm just going to say platform in general, to use it for their own purposes, including collection. So there's an ethical dilemma with data. Law enforcement can find the location of any phone within seconds. And when I say phone, because it's an automatic, it's a tracking device in your pocket or purse. Carriers selling out their subscribers. There's a lot people don't realize even today as to what carriers are actually doing with your data. I mean, this is really valuable stuff because it's individualized. That means in this kind of environment, there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. In the United States, there's a thing called third-party doctrine. You have no reasonable expectation that any of this is protected. You can sell access. You can be sold out. All of the data, it's not yours because it's held by a business entity. But of course, there's the old phrase, if there's nothing to worry about, then you have nothing to hide, or do you? So this is where the real dilemma comes in. So data is not just something that stands by itself. You can't go outside and take a shovel and start digging and then it just comes out of the ground. It's political, it's social, it is not value free. In fact, it is value laden. It always has value to somebody, but you have to consider who collects it, who stores it, who manipulates it. All of this matters. Data itself is also power, but it's the data collection, which is both a moral and an amoral act. It's all about intent. So where do you line the squares, right? Where do you line here? What rights? Are there rights? I mean, if you have access to the data, then maybe there aren't any rights. How do you, in fact, or does it even matter anymore, right? People are more than willing to have access, free email, free browsers, right? But they're giving up a lot as well. But is that part of the trade-off? So the other side of this is that much of what we're talking about is becoming increasingly weaponized, the persona level information. So what I call the dark side of personal data. Just imagine for the moment, all of these monitoring and surveillance systems just keeping track of everything, and it's in an insatiable diet. Recent examples. These are extremely recent. You may be familiar with the Verkada breach. This is a massive camera hack. Look it up. Stunning. You talk about intrusion, because guess what? Gained access to what was supposed to be a closed system, when in fact it wasn't closed at all. It gave access tens of thousands of cameras all over the place. Non-fungible tokens, this thing in this art world that's taken off. Well, Nifty Gateway, look it up, just happened. Stolen ownership accounts. There's stories now, people that thought they actually had like sold the non-fungible token, and yet guess what got taken? The ownership of it. Well, how do you, in this space, if it's a token with a non-reversible transaction, there's just lots of cyber grift, as I call it, going on. Signing value to a thing that isn't real but still has value, and then you get to sell it. And a lot of this is very much in the grift space. So what kind of a future are we looking at? Or is this all cyber nirvana? Meaning, does it really matter that the more and more data we have, with all the benefits of that in terms of our digital space? Or is there something more sinister? So context setting is extraordinarily crucial. Data absent context is data with no meaning. As I said earlier, all data is value laden. You lose the context, then you make up the meaning. It's incredibly seductive to turn all this into a reductive act, meaning you break it all up to manage and manipulate for other ends. So what do you do with your data? What is being done with your data? How do you frame your data? Are you being framed? Trading off data in this larger context has profound implications for society, particularly when you have all the overlays of surveillance deeply embedded in our everyday world. So the information age has rapidly shifted. What used to be a closed ball game, spies, secret electronic surveillance, private networks, are increasingly open networks. And even what are the so-called dark web is not all that dark. And how do you know who you are on internet? There's that famous cartoon from the 1980s in New Yorker magazine with the little dog looking up at the big dog, and the big dog is sitting in front of a pizza box and one of those tube CRT monitors, looking down at the little dog saying, hey, no one knows your dog on internet. How do you know who you are, and who are you? It's also increasingly cheap and widespread. It's increasingly easy to hide. But are there any secrets worth knowing? And what is even a secret in this space if there's no privacy or protection? More challenges. Information sharing. The irony here is, as much as we're sharing information, knowledge for some in terms of the data is control. And controlling in data avoids potential competition, loss of power. This is beyond like intellectual capital or intellectual property. It's what I call what I know data that you don't know data. This is coin of the realm. Information hoarding. So you have all these human factors as well as institutional, organizational, operating behaviors. These become major obstacles. More challenges. Small versus massive data. Huge differences. This is still a huge struggle. How do you, this is something that's happening to even to blockchain, right? Which is basically a fancy database, right? But the power necessary to actually drive it, right, takes up huge amounts of cycles. What's happening is you have these just massive environments. Classical query systems, right, require compute-intensive solutions. I'm just thinking about all the different types of knowledge ontologies, entity extraction. These are all weak in that they incur increasing processing costs with many false positives. So you look at everything, even in the space, oh, it's all available, but then what is of actual value? Complex AI queries. Okay, so AI becomes a solution. Let's just use AI because obviously we can't handle it, but AI itself is value laden. So we're falling way behind. default approach, analyst queries, data spilling on the floor, things being missed. AI is going to be the magic talisman to compensate for all this. We have to consider data differently, truly differently. We have to consider data actually in at least 3 dimensions, not just 2, because the 2 dimensions is what was the foundation to the digital age. You also have this to contend with in terms of data. Increasingly, a lot of state-sponsored actors and proxies want to take back the net. They want to control the net. This is done through what I call GovCo Incorporated. Where is your data? Remember, the fungibility of the data can be converted in numerous ways. It can be framed in different ways. Where did it go yesterday? Where is it going tomorrow? So what do we do? What do we do? Is it an advancement? This is just a fundamental question to ask ourselves. Is it an advancement in our society to give up our privacy because we're so beholden to the technology? We so want or so addicted to the marketing of us with all this digital data. We're often, more often than not, there is no opt-in. We can't kid ourselves. Even, industry self-regulation has decidedly not worked. But is there some kind of, universal with only specifically designated exceptions option as a way to get out of it all? We know all the benefits of the convenience. We know the efficiency of the internet. But it's also spawned all this dark side. And these are the things that bedevil us. So data can be used as a weapon, and internet is a delivery platform. This fundamentally comes down to, what do we do with you? So in the wrong hands, guess what? Well, if you're talking police government, yeah, this is increasingly happening. They can demand all kinds of records. They don't have to worry about the old school way of, surreptitious entry or remote installation, because it's already built in. And so we have this fundamental paradox between the industrial age versus the information and knowledge age, all enabled by digital data. But all of this exists in a society. All of this exists inside social structures. Who owns the data? Who has data sovereignty or sovereignty over the data? If Einstein had anything else to add to what our future looked like, it's obviously that the thinking that got us here today is insufficient for what we need tomorrow, just to channel them a little bit. You also have these challenges when it comes to data. Information sharing. As I said earlier, for many, knowledge is control. But often than not, it's also garbage in, garbage out. Or I can actually control the data in ways that allow me to manipulate it for other ends. Again, coining the realm in information hoarding. There's some additional ethical and practical implications. This conflict of interest between the pursuit of corporate profit or having to make sure the shareholders are kept happy. And then with respect to any of their subscribers or anybody that's using their services, it just makes it all inherently less secure. We also have issues with the private sector collecting and storing data. Data can be used as honeypots. There's data sovereignty issues, again, about who owns it. And then you have the sort of private sector performing public work, which is fundamentally a conflict of interest between profit and surveillance. So the fundamental question that I just want to leave you all with is, what future do we want to keep? Because ultimately, as a society at large, and it doesn't really matter where you are in our increasingly networked world, what future do you really want to keep? Is it simply keep addicting ourselves to the latest technology? But what happens to our very freedom, our very sovereignty, when it's placed in the wrong hands? Remember, this is really crucial. Only the government can create a police state or equivalent of a police state. And it's the technology that actually helps make that happen. So my challenge to all of you in terms of the ethics of data is to demand accountability. Because if we don't, then the trend lines are not good. But do you even care about this? Do you care enough to do something about it? There's many presentations that I've already seen at WEDF that address a lot of this in some aspect, whether it's security, whether it's information, whether it's the collection, what do we do with all this? And then finally, remember Rogue One, just to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek? Well, this is the pre-episode, right? Episode 4 in the Star Trek canon, Rogue One. Right before we actually find out how did Princess Leia Organa actually get access to the Death Star plans. Well, Rogue One actually has the answer. But it took an operation to actually gain access to it. Well, perhaps in the spirit of Rogue One, there still is hope. So thanks for listening. I just it was partly to provoke and stoke thought and consideration, just to step back for a moment, even if it's just a brief moment in the busyness of our lives, to consider the kind of society that we're actually creating in this technocratic world. Take care and enjoy the rest of the forum.